When we talk about figures who truly left a mark on bodybuilding, few names shine as brightly as Mike Matarazzo. He wasn't just an athlete. He was a phenomenon of charisma, presence, and raw energy, the kind of guy who could turn any stage into a full-blown show. Even among the sport's biggest legends, Mike stood out for the way he owned the spotlight, always flashing that unmistakable smile and instantly connecting with anyone watching. His spontaneous, larger-than-life personality won fans all over the world. That iconic tongue-out pose, the one that became his trademark, wasn't just a silly gesture. It was an extension of who he really was, an intense competitor who still knew how to have fun under the lights, something rare in a sport so demanding and serious. Physically, Mike was impossible to ignore. His arms and calves went down in history as some of the best ever seen, impressing even the biggest icons of the era. And even though he never won the sport's most prestigious titles, he became timeless. But the same industry that turned him into a star also dragged him toward a darker path. Behind the applause were extreme physical sacrifices, dangerous choices, and pressures that only a few can endure. Mike's journey, filled with glory, was also marked by pain, regret, and a brutal decline in health that would change everything. Mike Matarazzo's story begins far from the bright lights and cheering crowds he'd one day captivate. He grew up in a humble neighborhood in Boston, a place where opportunities were scarce and daily life demanded toughness, courage, and determination. In that rough environment, Mike learned early on that if he wanted a different life, he'd have to build it with his own hands, literally. For him, sports became a real escape valve. While many kids in the neighborhood got lost in trouble, Mike found discipline, focus, and purpose inside a boxing gym. Inspired by strong, heroic figures, he started boxing with a deep desire to strengthen not only his body, but also his mind. But as the years passed, adult life hit fast and hard. Before ever dreaming of a bodybuilding career, Mike worked as a truck driver, long hours on the road, doing whatever it took to pay the bills. It wasn't glamorous, but it built his character and resilience. And every day behind the wheel brought back the same nagging question: is this really what I want to do for the rest of my life? That inner conflict grew stronger every week. Boxing gave him a sense of power, progress, and belonging, things the highway could never offer. And the more he trained, the clearer it became that sports might be his ticket to something bigger. That's when Mike took his first real step toward transformation. With courage and a deep desire to change his future, he embraced athletic life as his one real chance to rise above his circumstances. When Mike Matarazzo stepped into the world of boxing, he truly believed that was his destiny. And for a while, everything pointed in that direction. In 1985, he won the prestigious Massachusetts Golden Gloves in the light heavyweight division, a title that's notoriously hard to earn, requiring talent, discipline, and grit. For most young fighters, that kind of win would be a clear sign to push harder in the ring. But for Mike, something unexpected started happening. Around that same time, he discovered weight training, at first just to enhance his boxing performance. But that supplemental training soon turned into a full-blown obsession. The idea of sculpting his own body, of seeing fast, visible changes in the mirror, hit him in a way boxing never had. It was as if he'd found a powerful tool to reinvent himself. Fueled by excitement, he started training with maximum intensity and almost zero technique. He ignored advice from veteran lifters, did exercises with sloppy form, and always chased the heaviest weights he could grab. The goal was simple: grow fast. And like many impatient young athletes, he thought raw strength mattered more than proper execution. Little did he know that this impulsive approach would one day push him past dangerous limits. That same mindset showed up in his diet, which was already taking some extreme turns. One of his most infamous experiments was the tuna shake mixed with orange juice, a blend that sounded like a horror movie prop, but, to Mike, meant fast gains. He was willing to try anything to accelerate muscle growth, even if it meant testing nutritional boundaries most people wouldn't dare touch. And the result? Rapid, almost shocking muscle growth. Mike looked like he was expanding week after week, as if his body were making up for lost time. But that uncontrolled growth revealed something important. He wasn't chasing balance, only size. It was the beginning of a pattern that would follow him throughout his entire career, and one that would one day come with a devastating price. Mike Matarazzo's first big turning point came in 1989 when he stepped on stage at the Massachusetts Gold Classic. With a massive physique and a presence that seemed bigger than the entire event, Mike didn't just win the heavyweight class, he took the overall title too. That was the moment people realized he wasn't just another kid from Boston trying his luck. He was the real deal, a rising star in bodybuilding. At that same show, Mike met Jim Manion, president of the NPC, who immediately recognized his potential. Manion saw in him something rare: charisma, size, and an energy that lit up an entire crowd. That meeting would shape Mike's future, opening doors that would soon push him onto the national scene and, not long after, into the professional ranks. In 1990, determined to level up, Mike made a radical decision. He moved to Venice, California, the heart of the bodybuilding world. Inside the legendary walls of Gold's Gym, he trained alongside giants like Flex Wheeler, Sean Ray, and other icons who would define the decade. The move wasn't just geographic, it was symbolic. Mike was leaving behind an ordinary life and betting everything on an audacious dream. It didn't take long for the results to show. In 1991, Mike stepped onto the NPC USA stage, one of the most prestigious amateur competitions, facing guys who would later become legends: Flex Wheeler, Chris Cormier, Ronnie Coleman. And against all odds, he won both the heavyweight class and the overall title, earning his pro card. In a single day, he went from unknown to a permanent name on the bodybuilding map. Right at that moment of ascension, the newly created WBF, led by Vince McMahon, offered him a $100,000 a year contract, around $220,000 in today's money, depending on inflation. For the time, it was a small fortune, but Mike turned it down. He chose to stay with the traditional IFBB, believing that was the legitimate path to building a legacy. Once Mike officially entered the pro circuit, he quickly understood that the game was far more complex than he ever imagined. As an amateur, being huge made you stand out. But among the pros, size was only the starting point. To go head-to-head with the best, he needed refinement, symmetry, and razor-sharp conditioning, levels that required increasingly risky methods. That constant pressure shaped the athlete and slowly began breaking him down. Determined to reach the perfect peak, Mike dove into extreme prep strategies. The quest for deep cuts, paper-thin skin, and maximum fullness pushed him into protocols few would dare attempt. Among them was the aggressive use of diuretics, crucial for stripping any water retention in the final minutes before stepping on stage. But as we would eventually learn, that obsession with visual perfection can cost far more than a trophy. The first major red flag came at the 1993 Arnold Classic, when Mike made one of the most dangerous mistakes of his career. Desperate to come in as dry as possible, he went overboard with potassium and diuretics. The consequences were brutal. Violent cramps seized his entire body. His vision started fading, and at moments he couldn't even see the audience in front of him. Even so, he tried to keep posing until he physically couldn't continue. He was rushed to the hospital, a traumatic experience that would forever change his relationship with the sport. Despite the scare, Mike didn't quit. In fact, he came back stronger and wiser between 1996 and 1998, the peak years of his career. In that stretch, he racked up impressive placings. 5th at the 1996 Night of Champions, 4th in 1997, 3rd in 1998, plus a runner-up finish at the Toronto Pro, and finally an impressive top 10 at the 1998 Mr. Olympia. That year, especially, cemented his place as one of the top names in the sport, proving his resilience was as massive as his physique. But it wasn't just his body that stood out, it was his vibrant spirit. Mike had a bold, unforgettable personality. His iconic tongue-out pose became a symbol, and his fearless moment stepping off stage to pose in the middle of the crowd at the 2001 Mr. Olympia showed just how much he valued real human connection. But after years of living on the edge, Mike Matarazzo's body began showing signs that it couldn't take much more. In 2001, he returned to the Mr. Olympia stage, the biggest bodybuilding competition in the world. But unlike previous years, the spark just wasn't there anymore. Mike finished in 21st place, one of the lowest rankings of his entire career, a clear message that something was seriously wrong. Not even his charisma, energy, or hunger to win could hide how worn down his body had become. For many athletes, a bad placing is just a bump in the road. For Mike, it was a brutal wake-up call. He felt he could no longer keep up with the new generation's extreme standards. And worse, he sensed his health deteriorating at an alarming pace. Each prep left him weaker, in more pain, and overwhelmed by a kind of exhaustion that wasn't normal. That feeling of invincibility he had in his early years was completely gone. That's when he made one of the hardest decisions of his life, stepping away from professional bodybuilding. After more than a decade giving everything, time, health, energy, emotion, to the sport, Mike realized that continuing could cost him his life. That moment marked not only the end of a career, but the beginning of a new chapter, filled with uncertainty, limitations, and fears he had never faced before. What made it even more painful was that this choice wasn't driven by desire, it was driven by necessity. The body he had built with so much effort was now presenting a bill too high to pay. His cardiovascular system was already showing signs of collapse, his energy levels were almost non-existent, and even simple everyday tasks were becoming difficult. It was as if everything that once made him famous was being stripped away, piece by piece. Mike's downfall didn't happen overnight. It came quietly, building over years of abuse, extreme dieting, and brutal prep cycles until the moment his body finally said, "Enough." In December 2004, at just 38 years old, Mike faced the first major emergency that would change everything. He woke up in the middle of the night coughing up blood and foam, struggling to breathe. It was a desperate sign that his heart was failing catastrophically. At the hospital, the news was devastating: congestive heart failure. 2 of his coronary arteries were completely blocked, and the third was nearly shut. The situation was so severe that doctors didn't hesitate. He needed an immediate triple bypass surgery to survive. For a man who had once represented strength, power, and vitality, hearing that his heart was on the verge of collapse was a brutal shock. It was in that moment that Mike truly began to understand the real cost of his bodybuilding journey. But the nightmare was far from over. In 2007, just 3 years after surgery, his arteries clogged again. During a routine exam, Mike suffered a heart attack, once again requiring urgent intervention. This time, doctors implanted a defibrillator in his chest to monitor and correct dangerous arrhythmias. His heart, which once beat with explosive force, was now functioning at only 20% to 25% capacity. And the warning was clear: if it dropped below 20%, he'd have to be placed on the transplant list immediately. From that point on, Mike's life changed completely. Unable to maintain the physical and emotional routine that defined him, he had to give up his job as a bail bondsman. His energy vanished, exhaustion became constant, and even the slightest pain caused panic. Mike began living in a permanent state of vigilance, constantly monitoring his own heartbeat, fearing that any irregular rhythm could be the last. And perhaps the most painful part of it all was his own awareness. Mike admitted, with heartbreaking honesty, that the choices he made during his bodybuilding years, the substances, the extreme diets, the severe dehydration, had destroyed his health. He knew he had crossed the line more than once, and now his body was collecting the debt. The real question lingering today is, how many athletes are still walking down that same path, believing that glory is worth any price? As his health problems progressed, Mike began looking back with painful clarity, the kind many athletes only gain far too late. In powerful interviews for Flex magazine, he opened up, revealing details that showed just how much his bodybuilding journey had been built on dangerous decisions. He explained that he always had genetically high cholesterol, something that put extra stress on his heart from a young age. Even so, he adopted an extreme diet, consuming between 11 and 15 pounds of red meat per day, 5 to 7 kilograms, with no vegetables, no fruit, and absolutely no balance. But the most striking part of his reflection was something else entirely. Speaking plainly, without sugarcoating anything, Mike said, the real problem was the chemicals, steroids, GH, and diuretics. He understood that these substances, so common behind the scenes of pro bodybuilding, had accelerated his decline in a devastating way. In his words, it wasn't the diet or the heavy training that destroyed him. It was the reliance on compounds designed to push a physique far beyond what any human body was ever meant to sustain. Many times, Mike said he truly believed he would have lived to old age if he had stayed away from performance-enhancing drugs. His regret wasn't just physical, it was emotional. He admitted that he had probably cut 20 years off his life expectancy, sacrificing a future that could have been full and peaceful with his family for the endless pursuit of perfection on stage. That emotional weight echoed in every interview he ever gave, like someone desperately trying to stop others from repeating the same mistakes. Because of this, Mike became a fierce advocate for something very few professional athletes have the courage to say out loud. He encouraged young bodybuilders to never touch the sport's drugs. He repeated the phrase that would become his most powerful legacy: "No level of fame is worth your life." After years living under constant pressure, extreme diets, and preps that pushed him to the edge, Mike left the stage behind and embraced a completely different life. He returned to the routine of an ordinary worker, far away from the fame and bright lights that had once defined him. The change may seem drastic, but for Mike, it was a real chance to start over, a chance to breathe without competing, comparing, or proving anything to anyone. With fragile health and a body marked by years of excess, he began doing only light exercise, moving with caution and awareness. No heavy training, no extreme weights, just walks, a few moderate lifting sessions, and his old punching bag to keep the love of boxing alive. These routines weren't about aesthetics, they were about survival, about keeping his heart working and preserving the little energy he still had. Mike also stepped away completely from the internet and social media. He rarely used a computer and joked that he was a caveman when it came to technology. But behind the humor was a deeper truth. He didn't want to follow online debates, gossip, or opinions about his physique, his career, or his past choices. After so many years being watched, judged, and criticized, he finally found comfort in silence. It was as if he were reclaiming a part of himself that had been lost during competition. In this new chapter, his family became his safe harbor. Mike dedicated himself wholeheartedly to simple moments with his wife and kids. One of his greatest joys was fishing with them, a tradition he inherited from his own father. In those small routines, he found a kind of happiness completely different from the adrenaline of the stage. Standing by the water, he was just Mike, and that was enough. And maybe the most beautiful part of this phase was the peace he discovered. A peace he never felt when his life revolved around metrics, rankings, and impossible expectations. Away from bodybuilding, Mike found what so many athletes search for and so few ever achieve. A place where a man's worth isn't measured by the size of his muscles, but by the size of his presence in the lives of the people he loves. In August 2014, the bodybuilding world was shaken by the news no one wanted to hear. Mike, already weakened and living at the edge of his cardiac capacity, was hospitalized in critical condition while waiting for a heart transplant. It was the final stage of a battle he had been fighting for more than a decade, a losing fight against the accumulated damage of years of extreme practices. Even with all the strength that once defined him, Mike now depended entirely on time, and time wasn't kind. On August 16, 2014, at just 48 years old, Mike passed away. The news spread quickly, bringing with it a wave of deep sorrow. It wasn't just the death of an athlete. It was the end of a story marked by charisma, talent, and above all, humanity. His passing exposed the undeniable fragility behind the muscles that once inspired thousands. Mike left too young, too soon, leaving behind questions, reflections, and a silent warning to everyone living at the frantic pace of competitive bodybuilding. The impact of Mike Matarazzo's death became clear through the tributes shared by some of the sport's biggest legends. Ronnie Coleman, 8-time Mr. Olympia, paid an emotional homage, remembering how Mike could make people smile even on the toughest days. Lou Ferrigno, another bodybuilding icon, spoke of the contagious energy Mike carried with him, something rare even among the giants of the sport. These tributes made it obvious that, beyond his impressive physique, Mike had something even more valuable, a generous heart and a presence that could light up any room. Barry Demiey and Samir Banout also expressed their admiration, recalling the humility that defined Mike, even at the height of his success. He never acted superior to anyone, never treated fans with indifference, and never let fame go to his head. On the contrary, he intentionally maintained genuine human connection, something many athletes lose along the way. To his peers, Mike wasn't just a competitor. He was a friend, a brother, someone who brought joy wherever he went. Mike Matarazzo's death didn't bring only sadness. It also sparked a deep conversation about responsibility, choices, and the limits of modern bodybuilding. Experts, fans, and even close friends began questioning how much the sport contributed to his death. Was it the drug use? The extreme diet? The years of chronic dehydration and grueling training? Or was it all of these factors combined with a genetic predisposition that had existed from the start? The truth is, there's no simple answer, and maybe that's exactly what makes this discussion so uncomfortable. It's common that, when a famous athlete dies young, people immediately look for a villain to blame. Some point to steroids as the sole cause, as if they were the only piece of the puzzle. But that ignores important nuances. Yes, drugs played a significant role. Mike himself admitted that. But reducing everything to one factor oversimplifies a reality that's far more complex. Genetics, lifestyle, pressure from the sport, and years of accumulated choices also shape the final outcome. Another question naturally arises. Why do we judge athletes' choices only after they die? It's as if death gives people permission to point fingers, ignoring the fact that many of these athletes did exactly what they believed they needed to do to compete in a system that demands superhuman perfection. Judging is easy. Understanding the context, the culture of bodybuilding, the unrealistic expectations, the fear of being left behind, is much harder. This harsh judgment ties into another problem, the culture of speculation. Right after Mike's passing, countless theories, improvised diagnoses, and definitive opinions spread from people who never met him and barely understood basic physiology. For many, it was enough to say, steroids killed Mike. But does such a shallow explanation actually help anyone? Or does it simply mask the systemic problems in the industry that continue affecting new athletes every day? The moral lesson left behind is painful, but necessary. Mike's legacy goes far beyond the stage, the competitions, or the muscles that made him famous. He inspired entire generations with his charisma, his contagious energy, and a physique that looked like it came straight out of a comic book. Many young people started training because they saw Mike pose, smile, interact with the crowd, and prove that bodybuilding didn't have to be just about brute strength. It could also be passion, identity, and expression. He inspired not just because he was huge, but because he was human. And it's exactly that humanity that makes his story so unforgettable today. Mike represents the real face behind the glamour of bodybuilding, the side that doesn't show up in magazines or promotional videos. He revealed that behind the shine of oil on stage, there's a body that suffers, a heart that gets tired, and a mind dealing with pressures the public rarely sees. His life showed both sides of the same coin, the dream that inspires and the sacrifice that destroys. At the same time, his journey became a growing warning within the industry. Mike became living proof that the price of the sport can be too high, and that glory doesn't always justify the risks. His honesty in his final interviews and his warnings to younger athletes now serve as a beacon, a reminder that choices made in haste can lead to irreversible consequences. Many athletes who came after him began seeing bodybuilding with more caution precisely because of his story. His tragic and premature death exposed the harsh reality so many knew nothing about. Mike showed the world that a sport capable of creating idols can also destroy, physically, emotionally, and socially, those who push themselves too far. He became a symbol of a system that needs change, of an industry that can no longer normalize extremes in the name of entertainment. His name echoes as a silent, but desperately needed, warning. Mike's story is one of those that stays with you for a long time. It inspires, moves, and awakens. And now that you've made it this far, I want to know, what part of his journey struck you the most? Was it the charisma, the meteoric rise, the extreme risks, or the final warning he left for future generations? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep this conversation alive and strengthens our community. If this video made you think, taught you something new, or simply kept you hooked until the end, don't forget to hit the like button. That helps the channel reach new people and keeps this work of telling real stories from the bodybuilding world alive. And if you want to support the channel even more, consider becoming a member. And of course, subscribe if you haven't already. Before you go, I want to invite you to continue this journey. There's another video on your screen right now. Click it and dive into another powerful story that deserves to be told. I'll see you there.